inflation is near historic highs now.
Inflation really is the problem that won't quite go away.
The Reserve Bank's warning inflation is still too high.
It's huge. It's every week.
Inflation. Yes, that pesky villain that's been sneakily raiding our wallets and giving economists sleepless nights. With the economy taking unexpected turns recently, many of us are feeling the pinch, no doubt. But did you know high inflation not only affects your purchasing power, but also your brain? Here's another question for you. Have you ever wondered why your grandparents are so cautious with money? Or why some people seem overly concerned with the economy all the time, even when things are going well? It turns out, the explanation lies somewhere on the fine line between economics and neuroscience. Behavioral economics has long told us that our financial decisions are influenced by habits, instincts, and psychological biases. But now, researchers are going a step further. Recent studies show how experiences like hyperinflation can literally rewire our brains, impacting not just individual choices but potentially influencing entire generations. Surprisingly, these effects linger long after inflation rates normalize, perhaps even for the rest of your life. In this video, we'll explore what the research says about the new economic thought of lived experience and how this might impact you. We're joined by Professor Ulrike Malmendier from the University of California, Berkeley, who has been pioneering research in this field in the past decade. So be sure to watch until the end if you want to understand how inflation touches our lives beyond what the central banks tell you.
In economics, we're starting off from a very traditional economics outlook at the world where everybody is this rational optimizer. Whatever happens, they take all the inputs, process them perfectly, and make the optimal decision. They may have constraints, not enough money, prices might be high, talking about inflation, but they take all of that into account and move on. Then behavioral economics came along and said, whoa, that's not really realistic. We humans make mistakes. We can't always perfectly understand what's going on in the world, process all the information rationally. So let's account for some biases. Let's account, for example, for people overweighing recent events. That's recency bias. Let's take into account that we are sometimes overconfident, overconfidence bias, and so on and so forth. And that was great progress. However, the problem is that economics is still stuck mostly in a world where we humans are like little robots, little computers, which is kind of are processing all the information coming in and coming to our decisions. Traditionally, to the optimal decision. Behavioral economics says, well, maybe it's not optimal. The software has some flaws, but it's still this computer processing. And what this new research about experience effects is about is to say, if I live through a crisis, for example, a high inflation crisis, hyperinflation, that changes me. That triggers something in me, some fears. If I see price tags that keep increasing, and I've lived through that for a while, it rewires my brain. It literally does, actually. Neuroscience tells us this. And we need to take that into account economics. So the view that once we are out of this inflation period, the central bank did the right things, inflation is back at 2%, the government did the right thing, everything is as it was before, to assume that therefore all the people in the country act like before is just wrong, because we have been rewired, we have been affected. What does that mean concretely? If you have lived for a relatively long period through high inflation, in particular if it was really high, if it was an emotional event, there was panic, there was fear, gets somewhat ingrained in your brain, similar to this concept of synaptic tagging we know from neuroscience. Long-term potentiation is another relevant term. And you just can't shake it off when the prices don't increase as much. It stays like this. Hence, I will act always a little bit more as if inflation is around the corner, as if I have to protect myself against that. And that has really big effects on financial decisions.
Like all Germans, Malmendier grew up with the specter of inflation and what it can do to people's livelihoods. In 1923, the German Weimar Republic economy experienced a catastrophic collapse, triggering a spiral of hyperinflation. In January 1923, $1 US was worth 17,000 marks. By December, the exchange rate skyrocketed to 4.2 trillion marks for a single dollar. That's a mind-boggling 24 billion% increase. Scenes in Berlin and other cities were surreal. Employees were paid each late morning so they could rush off and spend their wages by lunchtime. People carried buckets, bags, and even wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy groceries and other basic items. Kids played Richie Rich with real banknotes, while their parents used them as kindling. Talk about burning money. Millions of people found themselves bankrupt and struggling to make ends as their paper money was worth less than toilet paper. The middle class was completely obliterated and their savings evaporated. Since money was essentially useless, many simply turned to bartering. Amid this chaos, Germans struggled to understand what was happening to their country and why. They naturally doubted the ability of the state to keep things under control, which set the stage for Adolf Hitler's takeover in 1933. And we all know what followed next. This period wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a societal trauma. Those who lived through all this drama were scarred for life, permanently altering their relationship with money and finance in general. But remarkably, traditional economics hasn't considered these important, long-lasting effects. Whenever inflation rises beyond the norm, which is anything above the healthy inflation rate of 2% per year, central banks roll up their sleeves and start pressing levers to tone it down. Typically, they tinker with the interest rate and the money supply. The expectation is that once this delicate balancing act is successful and inflation is back under 2%, consumer behavior will return to normal. There's just one problem. That doesn't really work.
I've been motivated as a German by this big traumatic event of the hyperinflation in Germany during the Weimar Republic. I always use it as an example, as a motivating example. My historical data doesn't go quite as far back. I have been using US data from the last decades, which include the 1970s and 1980s when the US had double-digit inflation at times. I've been using European data. The European Central Bank has a very nice survey from the last 2 decades. And there's a lot of variation across different European countries, some having higher inflation, some lower inflation. And over and over, you see, independent of the country or the decade you look at, that people whose life so far has been characterized by a lot of high inflation, they continue to live with that fear, even when the inflation is not there. But my best example is maybe, there's a data set called the American Community Survey, and it, ACS, and it has data on people who immigrated into the US. So they all live in the US now, but they come from all sorts of different countries. Argentina, Iran, Germany, name it. And so what I did then is I got their birth year, it's in the data set, the country where they're from, and just calculated the inflation they have lived through in their home country, which has nothing to do with the US, right? They're in a different country now. And still you see in their financial decision-making that they put a lot of weight on what their previous experience are. If they come, say, from Argentina, lots of high inflation, they constantly try to protect their money. And so that's a really good example for how these experiences really affect you, rewire you, even if you know it's not relevant. History will repeat itself because, it's biology, it's neuroscience, neuropsychiatry. Just we get rewired, we have these reactions. But the question is the event that triggers these reactions the same? So what I mean is, one extreme is the German hyperinflation from 1923, or inflation in Argentina, really high inflation experiences. You're totally right that both in the US and Europe, we were either crossing the 2-digit, boundary or getting close to it. And so there was definitely the danger that the same thing would happen again. Now the question is, it matters how long it happens, how severely it happens, how much people are affected. As an anecdote, the Germans last year had one policy measure, which was called in German the Tankrabatt, so the gas price discount. So when gas prices went up, everybody at the gas pump was like, oh my God, it's so expensive. Those increases came, of course, from the fact that we had less energy supply. That's why prices go up. And it's kind of good that they go up because consumers should react and consume less and drive less because there's little supply. So then the German government came in and said, we subsidize gas prices. And all the economists went, are you out of your mind? The signal of prices is really important so consumers know how to reduce it. You can't subsidize it, and they consume too much. Everything is out of balance. And that is true. I mean, on net, I'm definitely still in that camp. But there was one aspect. I might be the only economist defending this policy because it helped prevent the shock of inflation to really get ingrained in people's minds so much, right? When they went to the gas pump, it was somewhat limited how much prices keep creeping up. And as a result, there was less fear, less panic. There was a good aspect to this.
You've seen these rising prices at the gas pump and supermarket, but what does this do to our brains? Every new experience we encounter, like these climbing prices, prompts our brain to form fresh neural connections or synapses. And when we repeatedly experience something, these connections get stronger. This process is known as synaptic tagging, a key phenomenon in learning and memory. Another important term is long-term potentiation, or LTP. This is where signal transmission between neurons is enhanced after they're stimulated together. It's like strengthening a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. LTP is also crucial for our learning and memory. These phenomena are tied together by the overarching theme of neuroplasticity, which refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections, reorganizing brain pathways, and even forming new neurons throughout life. So, how does this relate to financial crises or the ever-rising cost of living? When we undergo financial stress, like witnessing a market crash or high inflation, the emotional experience creates strong synaptic connections. These memories become pivotal in how we make future financial decisions later in life. In other words, our financial behaviors and attitudes are never static, but are shaped and reshaped by experiences. Let's take an example. Previously, Malmendier published studies showing so-called depression babies, or people who grew up experiencing the Great Depression, had a noticeably lower involvement in the stock market compared to those who lived through more financially stable times. The traumatic events unfolding during the Great Depression, when the Dow Jones crashed by up to 90%, would have created strong synaptic connections. In this case, living through the hardship caused by a stock market crash makes people weary to invest in stocks in the future, just like living through inflation can make people very protective of their money.
I think that the scientific literature on trauma is really the most helpful here. So if you read about trauma, I mean, it's pretty gruesome, but in the neuroscience and neuropsychiatry textbooks, it often talks about examples like, war, severe accidents, abuse, childhood abuse, later abuse is a horrific example. It also mentions often in one sentence there can also be economic trauma, but then psychiatrists don't really know how to think about it. But in any case, it then talks about how your brain gets rewired and how a certain connection it's just kind of established, and like when you see something, it triggers some reaction, right? And like in the war case, you come back, you live in Germany or you live in the US, and you hear loud noise, say, of a car starting. It's similar to a bomb coming down, and there's no danger, and yet you have this immediate reaction, like as if that traumatic event was happening again. And this kind of rewiring happens also with economic trauma. And events like the Weimar hyperinflation, but also the Great Depression in the US, the pandemic, these are all traumatic events, and we have to take this evidence, this neuropsychiatry evidence, seriously, bring it into economics and understand that what we lived through will have this lasting impact, very much like in the trauma literature. And just getting across the message that, as a politician or policymaker, you want to combat the crisis, you want to get back to the situation where before is all good, definitely keep doing that, but please don't think that people will behave the same way they behaved before the crisis. So just to kind of have this awareness that it's not because we are older, we act differently, or other reasons, because we're poorer or richer, we act differently. No, it's because we have lived through certain common experience that we are changed. I mean, this whole concept of Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, millennials, like, why is it? Why do we think generations, people born around the same time, behave similarly in certain ways? Well, they have common experiences that have shaped them. And that's what policymakers need to take into account. So now, in many European countries, for example, in Germany, where I'm advising the politicians, we have to take into account these are people who lived through COVID-19, who lived through the energy crisis and will be a little more scarred, will have more worries about price increases, will have more worries about health concerns, will have more worries that, their professional world might be turned upside down on a dime in a way like that wouldn't have entered the thinking before. So just this awareness, I think, is very helpful, so people don't make wrong predictions, don't make wrong simulations. But then, more concretely, what if we want to address this? Like the scarring in the inflation example is not of the type, oh, you lived through this crisis, now it's set in stone, like that you will act in this way for the rest of your life. The concept of neuroplasticity gives you that there are long-lasting effects, but it also gives you that when the times are good again for long enough, you rewire again and things will get better. So trying to think about how you can do that as fast as possible is important. Concretely, in monetary policy, for example, central banks are very concerned about their credibility, that people believe that they will get inflation under control, back to this target of 2% many of the central banks have. And always want to make sure that everybody thinks their policy announcements are credible. And if they can make a very credible policy announcement, we will control monetary supply in a way or raise interest rates in a way that it will combat inflation, they think everything is good. What I'm saying is, I mean, that's good, you should be credible, but don't think just the announcement will do the trick. It will only happen when it is fully arrived, when in my supermarket and in my gas pump, I see, okay, things are back to normal. And I have to see it for a while before it really sets in. So whenever I can, try to think about what's most effective for the lived reality of people, rather than just the theoretical announcement, do they believe me? If they believe me and understand things, they should realize inflation will go down, and therefore they should act already as if it's over. That makes a lot of sense in economic models, sophisticated economic models, not in the reality. Now, what if I can't do that? Sometimes I can't quickly, affect like how your life looks like. Here, I think media and communication can do a lot. So if we could go away, given that we're talking about inflation, let me stick to that example. If we can go away from the rather dry monetary policy announcements and explain better with example, with almost like experiential learning, what we have in mind. Favorite example here is Central Bank of Jamaica uses reggae songs to explain to people like how they think about inflation and the goals they want to reach.
Committee to Jamaica and the economy, and the best way forward is using an inflation targeting strategy. Predictable, stable and low. Inflation targeting the way to go. Car loan, school fee can start out. Granny saving now get knocked out. And the BOG inflation targeting strategy, that's low, stable, predictable. Yeah.
That's what the new economics would predict, that we should think more about. I was talking to Christine Lagarde about it, and she said, okay, you're saying I should, have Netflix movies about monetary policy. And yes, kind of. And a little bit, the ECB is doing it already, right? Just if it can't be our real lived experience, something close to it, something, we can see with media and make it close to really experience, I think would be really helpful.
Those are all great tips for the policymakers and other people in charge who are responsible for protecting the economy. But what about you or me? What can we everyday people do to protect our wealth and hard-earned money from high inflation? Don't close this video just yet, because for some of you, the most useful part of this reporting is just about to be revealed. Here are some actionable ways to hedge against inflation.
In a high inflation environment, you're always looking for ways to put your money into assets that won't be affected by it. I mentioned the example real estate before, right? So if I put my money into buying a house, well, you know, inflation may kick in, the dollar or euro or wherever I live might be worth less, but the price of that asset will automatically adjust. A famous traditional one used to be gold or metals and so on. And it's, you know, it's not necessarily a great investment, but that aspect, you know, depends on the time. That aspect is true, that it protects against inflation. But what I would like to emphasize today is the stock market. In Germany, in particular, stock market participation is still like deplorably low. I think Germans, and not only Germans, many countries, and you don't think about, investing in the stock market, you have to pick stocks and it's speculation and who knows what's right. These days, it's not like this. These days, we can invest in broadly diversified funds worldwide. That means really almost no risk. You know, it goes up and down, but a little bit, and just, it's pretty boring. It just kind of keeps slowly going up. You know, sure, there might be a crisis, but if you have like a long-term perspective, it will keep going up. So learning that, first of all, with the stock market, kind of almost independently of our discussion, and then realizing, plus, if I live through a high inflation environment, I'm automatically protected because, you know, the firms are producing real output. The prices of those will adjust, so automatically their profits will adjust to the inflation. It is also an inflation hedge, I think, could be very helpful. And so in this day and age where we can open online depots, online trading accounts, and invest in broadly diversified funds with almost no fee, because a simple computer program can do this for us now. I really hope that more people, and I see it in the young generation, but you know, even more people of all age groups will take advantage of that.
Our journey through behavioral economics shows us that financial decision-making is far more complex than mere numbers and incentives. It's a process woven from our past experiences, emotions, and the ever-evolving neural pathways of our brains. If you found all of this fascinating, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more science news. What has your experience with inflation been like? Can you relate to the conclusions of this research? Let us know in the comments. See you next time.